Hi, this video is on cellular respiration. We're going to start talking about ATP because that is the point of cellular respiration, is at the cellular level making ATP for cell functions. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it is the usable form of energy for cells. Plants make their own food in photosynthesis. Animals and other organisms absorb or eat food. And it's basically changed into glucose in the bloodstream. Glucose is the main source of food passed on through the food chain, etc. But each individual cell needs to make ATP. So it's taking in glucose, and in most cases using oxygen to go through this process, making ATP and changing the energy stored in the bonds of the glucose molecule into energy stored in the bonds of the ATP molecules is what needs to be done in this process called cellular respiration. ATP is the usable form of energy for cell functions. Cells need to do work, they need to make more cells, they need to move things, they need to make proteins, etc. Anything a cell needs to do and needs energy for, they need to use ATP. Think of it kind of like a foreign currency. You can't go to Europe and use American dollars. You have to change into euros and use their currency. When you're doing cell work, they need to use ATP. They can't use glucose. They can't use another form of energy, light energy, etc. They have to change it to ATP to be able to do their cell jobs. Okay? I suggest watching this video. It will be helpful to you if you're doing this remotely. Looking at this molecule, ATP is an example of a nucleotide, a nucleic acid. It has a nitrogen base here, and there's a sugar. You can see, tell by the shape of it. And then here's the phosphates, and there's 3 separate phosphate groups. What happens when ATP is formed in the process of cellular respiration is it's ready to go. It's an energy source ready to be used by pulling off this last phosphate. You can see up here where this high energy bond, it's a catabolic reaction where this phosphate is going to be removed and energy will be released to be able to do cell functions. So what happens is we put it back on. That P is constantly recycled, and anytime energy is needed, the last phosphate is broken off. Here's a look at the reaction as far as how energy is going to be used. This is ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphate groups. Through catabolism, through hydrolysis, it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus phosphate. So this bond right here between the second and third phosphates is broken, and when the phosphate is released and that bond is broken, the energy stored in that bond is released. This is the usable form of energy for cells. In the process of cellular respiration, ADP becomes ATP again, ready to go for the next time the cell needs energy. So this is constantly just a reused, recycled molecule. ATP is broken down to get energy, and then we put it back on so it's ready to go to give energy again. So constantly using our food sources, or in the case of plants, the photosynthesis, the energy from the sun, to get eventually to this molecule. It is definitely a nucleotide here as far as looking at the parts of a nucleotide, the base, the phosphates, and the sugar. It is an exothermic process, releasing energy stored in that bond to break down ATP, definitely hydrolysis, as it says. Water helps break it down, and that would be catabolism as far as answering the questions on the screen here. All right, it's a little more complicated than that. So I would like you to know the steps. There's going to be some extra chemicals that I mentioned here that I'll kind of explain aren't super important. I want you to know they're energy-carrying chemicals. So I'll highlight what you need to know here. Glycolysis is the first step of cellular respiration. Whether there's oxygen or whether there's not oxygen, it's the first step. So we're going to talk about aerobic respiration in this screencast. There'll be another one in the next slideshow that has anaerobic respiration without oxygen. So realizing they are a little bit different, but they both will start with glycolysis. That happens in the cytosol, the cytoplasm of the cell, not in any membrane-bound organelles yet. And what happens is glyc stands for glucose as far as this first part here. Lysis means to split, just like hydrolysis is splitting with water. This is splitting the glucose molecule into 2 molecules called pyruvate. It can also be called pyruvic acid, same thing. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. It is split into 2 3-carbon molecules. The pyruvate or pyruvic acid, it's catabolism. It's releasing some energy. In this reaction, there's a net of 2 ATP released. It's not a lot of ATP, but it does carry on life functions, and some organisms can survive on that. In aerobic respiration with oxygen, we're going to use the cell organelle called a mitochondria. We have that in human cells. Animals, plants, higher organisms have mitochondria in the complex eukaryotic cells. And what happens here is that the pyruvate will enter the mitochondria, and there's a couple other things going on as far as acetyl-CoA and some different enzyme action happening. But essentially, it will go into the mitochondria, and then in the presence of oxygen, the Krebs cycle will help make 2 more ATP, and then the electron transport chain, ETC, will help make up to 34 more ATP. This process has these carriers, and that's what I want to point out. You don't necessarily need to know what NADH is or FADH2. They're energy-carrying molecules. That's what I want you to know. So these electrons are carried to this next step. The Krebs cycle makes only 2 ATP, but it makes a whole lot of these energy-carrying molecules to go to the 3rd step of respiration, the electron transport chain, and then make a whole bunch of ATP. So I would like you to know the names of the steps, where they occur in the cell, and then the rough amount of ATP made in each space. You don't need to know the energy-carrying molecules. So glycolysis in the cytoplasm makes 2 net ATP, that as well as the pyruvate, the energy-carrying molecules will go to the mitochondria, needing oxygen at this point. Glycolysis didn't need it. Going through the Krebs cycle to make a couple more, and the electron transport chain to make a whole bunch of ATP, excuse me. It's a pretty good, efficient process at making ATP from 1 glucose molecule. Up to a total of 38 ATP can be made. That's not always the case. That's kind of an ideal situation. A super fit person that is, maximizing their respiration potential here. But in any case, it makes a lot of ATP from 1 glucose molecule compared to anaerobic respiration, which you will compare to in the next slideshow. What I would like you to know then is the overall process of cellular respiration. It happens at the cellular level. Keep that in mind. Every cell in your body, from your brain cell to your big toe cell to your liver cell, needs to go through this process. It's the usable form of energy that is being made, this ATP, in this process, so every cell needs to do it. We're going to start with glucose as our fuel source, and it's a combustion reaction in the presence of oxygen. Break that down in the mitochondria here, make water, carbon dioxide, and ATP, again up to 38 when we're looking at eukaryotic organisms using mitochondria. You need to eat. That's what ultimately going to be your source of glucose. Your body will break it down and turn it into glucose. Your bloodstream will carry it throughout your body to all your individual cells. You're going to breathe and do gas exchange with the atmosphere, taking in more oxygen. When you inhale and when you exhale, that oxygen can be carried through your bloodstream to all your cells, again, including your big toe. When you have the glucose and oxygen, the cells can then take those in from the bloodstream, make the byproducts, water and carbon dioxide, and generate that ATP as needed. Cells such as muscle cells have a lot more mitochondria and do respiration a lot more than some other cells will, because they're more active and they have a higher energy need. I would like you to know the steps of the process, how much ATP is made at each step, as well as, again, the overall reaction. As far as it goes, again, knowing the energy-carrying molecules, you don't necessarily need to know the specific names of them, but here's kind of the importance of it. It's a way to get ATP, which is the usable form of energy. It's a transfer of energy from the bonds of the glucose to the molecules of ATP, so that 3rd phosphate can be broken off and cells can do their cell functions. Know the balanced chemical equation, the word equation, so you can go through the overall process in that way. Hope that was helpful.